The rain hammered against Elara's skin like frozen needles. Each drop was a cold reminder that her time was running out. Her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps as she stumbled through the lightless forest, her simple green gown snagging on thorns that clawed at her like the fingers of the dead. Behind her, the howls of the hunters grew closer, vibrating through the ancient trees. They found me. The thought sent a surge of ice through her veins. For 3 days she had been a ghost in the shadows, running from a world that feared the secret boiling in her blood, a power that had once laid waste to her home and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Thunder cracked overhead and Elara pressed herself against the rough bark of an oak, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the trackers could hear it echoing through the storm. She was good at hiding. She had to be. It was the only reason she was still alive. Lightning split the sky in a stark white flash, and that's when she saw him. A massive wolf lay crumpled against a fallen log just 20 feet away. His fur, thick and dark, was matted with blood that looked black in the moonlight. One hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his breathing was so shallow Elara thought he was already gone. "Keep running," her survival instinct screamed. "This isn't your problem." But seeing him there, broken, abandoned and left to die, made her chest tighten with an ache she knew all too well. She knew the sting of being cast out by those who should have protected her. The memory of her own pack's rejection burned through her like acid. Another howl pierced the night, closer now. She had minutes, maybe less, before the hunters caught her trail. Elara looked at the dying wolf one last time, and the compassion in her blood finally won. "Damn it," she whispered, her boots slipping on wet leaves as she dropped to her knees beside his massive form. Up close, the injuries were even more horrific. Deep gashes tore through his ribs, but it was the scent that made her blood freeze. Silver. The metallic tang was unmistakable, poisonous to their kind. This wasn't a hunting accident, this was an execution. Elara's consciousness returned like a slow ascent from the bottom of a frozen lake, her mind disoriented and heavy. The first thing she noticed was warmth, real deep warmth that seeped into her bones, a stark contrast to the needle-like rain of the storm. It wasn't the frantic, burning heat of her own healing gift, but something steady and grounding that made her want to sink further into the plush furs beneath her. Then came the scent, a heady, masculine blend of cedar, mountain pine, and something wild that made her pulse quicken with an instinctive awareness she couldn't name. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she wasn't under the canopy of the ancient oak. Instead, she lay on a massive bed in a room carved from ancient stone, the walls rising around her like the interior of a fortress. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting dancing shadows across the chamber. The last thing she remembered was the hunters, howls closing in, and the desperate, silver-tainted blood of the wolf. She remembered the metallic scent of poison, and the way she had poured her very essence into his broken body until the world went white. "You're awake." The voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the air, deep and commanding. Elara bolted upright, her head spinning as the sudden movement reminded her how much the healing had drained her. A figure stepped out of the shadows by the window and into the firelight. Elara's breath hitched. He was an imposing man, easily standing over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled the room with a physical, predatory force. Dark hair fell in waves to his collar, framing chiseled features that looked as though they had been sculpted from the mountain itself. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart, sharp, intense golden eyes that burned with the exact same intelligence as the wolf she had saved in the forest. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice rough and lacking the strength she tried to project. "Where am I?" The man's lips curved into a smile that lacked warmth, an expression that reminded her of a predator baring its teeth. "You saved my life, little healer," he said, his voice holding a dangerous edge of authority. "Did you truly think I wouldn't find out who you were?" Fear, cold and familiar, spiked in her chest. He knew. Somehow this man knew about the secret in her blood, the gift she had spent 3 years trying to hide from the world. She tried to push herself off the bed, her mind already racing for an exit, but he moved with a lethal grace that was faster than humanly possible. In 2 strides, he was across the room, placing a hand on her shoulder. The pressure wasn't rough, but it was absolute, making it clear that she was no longer a fugitive on the run, but a guest who wasn't permitted to leave. "I am Kieran Darkfang," he murmured, his golden eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "And you, Elara Moonstone, have just healed the Alpha King." Elara pulled away from Kieran's touch as if his skin were made of the very silver that had nearly ended him, wrapping her arms tightly around her chest. The name he had spoken, her real name, echoed against the stone walls like a death knell. For 3 years, she had been a shadow, a nameless ghost drifting between territories to escape the blood on her hands, yet this king looked at her as if she were a miracle rather than a monster. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling as she backed toward the far wall of the chamber. "I'm not the savior your golden eyes think I am. I am a walking disaster, and if you knew the truth of what my gift does, you would have left me in that forest to the hunters." Kieran didn't move, but his predatory focus never wavered from her face. "Tell me what happened, Elara," he commanded softly, the weight of his authority softened by a strange, burning intensity. The memories crashed over her like a riptide, pulling her back to the night her world turned to ash. She spoke of the Silver Moon Pack in Fessus, the boy she had loved with a naive, unchecked heart. She described the moment he was brought back dying of silver poisoning, and how she had poured every ounce of her silver flame into his veins to pull him back from the edge. "My power isn't normal healing," she said, her voice hollow as she stared into the crackling fire. "It's transformative. It awakens things that should stay buried." She told him how Fessus hadn't just healed. He had changed into something ancient and primal, a direwolf that knew only the thrill of the kill. By the time the madness took him, 16 innocent wolves lay torn apart in his wake. "I created a monster, Kieran," she choked out, the tears finally spilling over. "The Pack Council banished me because I was too dangerous to stay, warned that if I ever used this cursed gift again, they would hunt me down and end me. I killed the boy I loved and 16 others as surely as if I'd held the blade myself." She braced herself for the shift in his expression, for the warmth to vanish and be replaced by the familiar fear and disgust she had seen in her father's eyes. She expected him to call his guards to drag the exile from his mountain. Instead, Kieran stepped closer, his presence warm and grounding. "You think that story makes me want to reject you?" he asked, his voice a low, devastating caress. To her shock, a gentle smile transformed his lethal features. He reached for her trembling hands, holding them steady in his own. "Elara, do you know what bloodline runs in my veins? I am what Fessus became, but I was born to it. You didn't curse him. You revealed a nature he wasn't prepared to handle." For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight of her guilt felt a fraction lighter. But as Kieran pressed a kiss to her knuckles, Elara couldn't shake the chilling thought of his counsel, and whether they would truly see her as a mate, or merely a tool to awaken the monsters they desired. 3 hours later, Elara found herself following Kieran through a forest that seemed older than time itself, where the air hummed with a power that made her skin tingle. The trees here were massive, ancient pines and oaks that stretched so high their canopies disappeared into a silver mist. Moss covered everything in a blanket of ethereal green, and the very ground felt alive beneath her feet. Kieran moved with a fluid, lethal grace, never stumbling or hesitating, while Elara struggled to keep pace with his long strides. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breathless as she noticed symbols carved into the tree bark that seemed to shift whenever she looked away. "Somewhere you need to see," Kieran replied, his golden eyes glowing with an inner fire in the dappled light. "This is the heart of the wilds, the oldest sacred site in the Northern Territories. It is where the barrier between our world and the spirit realm grows thin." He stopped in a clearing dominated by a massive stone altar covered in symbols Elara somehow understood without ever having been taught. There were wolf heads intertwined with flames and moons in every phase. At the center was a mark that made her heart stop, a silver wolf surrounded by fire. It was the mark of the silver flame, the legend of the one chosen to bridge the gap between wolf and spirit. "Show me," Kieran said gently, his eyes tracking the movement of her hand as it moved toward her left shoulder. With trembling fingers, Elara pulled aside the collar of her gown to reveal the birthmark she had hidden her entire life. In the sacred light of the grove, it wasn't just a mark anymore. It was a brand that pulsed with silver fire, identical to the carving on the altar. As their skin touched, the symbols on the stone blazed to life, and the air filled with ancient voices speaking a language that predated human memory. When silver flame burns bright and dire wolf walks in flesh, the marked one shall arise, the voices whispered through her mind. Elara backed away, her breath hitching in terror as she realized the prophecy wasn't just a story, it was a living spell unfolding within her. Kieran stepped closer, his presence warm and grounding amidst the mystical chaos. "Prophecies aren't real," she whispered, even as she felt the truth settling into her bones like molten gold. "They saw you, Elara," Kieran said, his voice infinitely gentle. "Every oracle in 5 territories had the same vision the moment you healed me. The question isn't whether you're ready, it's whether you're brave enough to stop running from it." The clearing began to pulse with an ancient rhythm, and Elara felt something stirring deep in her chest. Not just her healing power, but a destiny she could no longer deny. The ancient rhythm of the grove was shattered not by magic, but by the cold, sharp snap of a dry branch. The forest, which had been humming with the song of the silver flame, suddenly went silent. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no whisper of wind, only the heavy, suffocating silence that preceded the strike of a predator. Elara's blood chilled as familiar howls echoed through the ancient pines, the same jagged sounds that had chased her through the storm 3 nights ago. "They found us," she breathed, her hands beginning to shake. Kieran's expression hardened instantly, his features shifting into a mask of lethal intent. Through the trees, shapes began to move, wolves in human form, armed with weapons that glinted with the deadly, polished shine of blessed silver. At their head walked a figure Elara recognized with a jolt of terror, Alpha Silver Moon. The man who had banished her, the man who had promised to end her life if she ever used her gift again, stepped into the sacred clearing with the absolute authority of a man who had never lost a battle. "Elara Moonstone," his voice boomed, carrying the weight of a death sentence. "You were warned. Did you think we wouldn't feel the ripples of power when you broke our laws? Did you think we wouldn't feel it when you awakened another monster?" He raised a silver-blessed rifle, his eyes fixed on Kieran with undisguised disgust. Behind him, 20 warriors spread out in a perfect hunting formation, their weapons leveled at the pair. "He is not a monster," Elara cried out, stepping forward to put herself between Kieran and the armed wolves. "You don't understand what really happened." "I understand that you murdered my son," the Alpha roared, his voice thick with raw pain and rage. "And I sentence you both to death." Kieran's hand clamped down on Elara's wrist with implacable strength, pulling her back behind him. "Stand down, Silver Moon," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register that made the very air vibrate. "I am the Direwolf King, heir to bloodlines that ruled before your ancestors learned to walk, and I am her mate." Power exploded outward from him like a physical shock wave. Elara watched in stunned awe as Kieran's human form began to stretch and reshape, muscles rippling and bones lengthening, until an enormous black wolf stood where the man had been moments before. He was a creature of ancient wisdom and lethal grace, radiating an authority that made the other wolves instinctively want to bare their throats in submission. The Alpha fired, the shot cracking through the grove like thunder. Without thinking, Elara threw out her hands, silver flame erupting to meet the bullet. The projectile disintegrated into harmless sparks against her barrier of light, but the effort sent a lance of pain through her skull. As she staggered, the massive form of the black wolf pressed against her side, supporting her weight and letting out a low, guttural snarl that promised a violent end to anyone who dared move another step closer to his claim. The hidden cave Kieran led her to felt like stepping into another world entirely, far removed from the violence and silver-tipped arrows of the sacred grove. After Elara had somehow banished the encroaching shadows with a surge of silver flame that left her unconscious for hours, they had barely escaped before the silver moon reinforcements could close the trap. Now, deep in the mountains that bordered the Darkfang territory, they found sanctuary in a cavern that seemed carved from living crystal. Firelight danced across walls embedded with veins of silver and quartz, casting everything in a warm, ethereal glow that mirrored the humming energy in Elara's own chest. A natural hot spring bubbled at the far end of the cave, filling the space with a gentle steam that smelled of minerals and ancient magic. It was a place of profound peace, completely at odds with the turmoil raging in Elara's mind. She settled onto the furs Kieran had spread near the fire, her whole body aching from the strain of channeling more power than she had ever dared to touch. Kieran had shifted back to his human form hours ago, but the wolf remained visible in the way he moved, patient, protective, and watchful. He tended the fire with a practiced efficiency, the regal authority he usually wore like armor cracking to reveal the man beneath the crown. What was it like? Elara found herself asking, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet cavern. Growing up knowing what you were. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeing decades of old pain reflected in the embers. He spoke of a childhood defined by loneliness, explaining that direwolves were often too dominant and powerful for normal packs to understand. He described the years spent leashing his hunger and suppressing the killing instinct, all while the elders watched him with a fear that he might become a mindless beast of legend. "I never took a mate because I was waiting for you," he said, turning to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached out, his thumb brushing across her lips with a devastating gentleness that sent a shiver through her entire being. He confessed that he had been searching for her for over a decade, following fragments of destiny written in starlight and shadow. "I'm still dangerous," she whispered, the old fear of her own curse flickering one last time. "You are magnificent," Kieran countered, his hands framing her face with infinite care. He took her hands and placed them flat against his chest, right over his heart, commanding her to feel the connection that went beyond the physical. Through that touch, Elara saw his memories, the weight of his crown and the bone-deep loneliness that mirrored her own. She saw that he looked at her not with fear or disgust, but with a reverence that took her breath away. In the warmth of that crystal sanctuary, the walls Elara had built around her heart began to crumble, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe she was no longer alone. Elara woke to the sound of voices, low and urgent whispers that made her blood run cold even before the meaning of the words took hold. Dawn light filtered through the cave entrance, painting the crystal walls in shades of amber, but the warmth she had felt the night before had vanished. Kieran sat with his back to her near the mouth of the cavern, his silhouette framed against the morning sky. For a heartbeat, her heart warmed at the sight of her anchor, her mate, the man she thought had finally ended her years of isolation. Then she heard his voice, and her entire world shattered. "The binding is almost complete. She trusts me now," Kieran said, his tone carrying clearly in the still air. He was speaking to someone Elara couldn't see, but the second voice was female and cultured, possessing the sharp accent of the High Council. "One more night, and she'll be completely under the mate bond's influence." Elara pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out, her body trembling with a sudden, violent shock. "And you're certain she won't sense the manipulation?" the woman asked. "Direwolf bonds are different," Kieran replied, and there was a clinical, detached edge to his voice that Elara had never heard before. They are designed to create complete submission. Once fully established, she'll be incapable of refusing any command I give her. The silver flame power will be mine to control." The words hit Elara like physical blows, carving deeper into her heart than any hunter's blade. She had been a fool, a desperate, naive fool who believed someone could love her for who she was instead of the weapon she carried in her blood. "Excellent," the counselor continued. "The council was worried your emotional involvement might compromise the mission. We wondered if you were actually developing feelings for the target." Kieran's laugh was cold, a sound of pure calculation. Feelings for a creature destined to tear holes in reality? Please. She's a weapon, counselor. A very dangerous weapon that needs to be properly leashed before she destroys everything. Elara's hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder, where the mate mark had appeared during the night, a silver flame intertwined with a black wolf. She had woken thinking it was a sign of destiny and love. Now she realized it was nothing more than a collar. "I've simply been feeding her instincts while building the psychic connections necessary for total control," Kieran mused with dark satisfaction. He spoke of her as a researcher might speak of a specimen, explaining that the process of breaking her had required a more intimate approach than originally planned to bypass her natural resistance. Every kiss, every gentle touch, and every vulnerable confession had been a calculated lie designed to destroy her defenses. "She'll be a perfectly obedient vessel for silver flame power and nothing more," Kieran concluded. Maya bit down on her fist until she drew blood, using the pain to keep from screaming. Staring at the cave ceiling, the life she had started to envision crumbled into ash. The mate mark burned like a brand, and she could feel his influence pressing against the edges of her mind, trying to sink deeper. She reached deep into herself, past the betrayal, down to the core of the flame that was hers alone. If Kieran wanted a weapon, she would give him one, but it would not be the obedient tool he expected. When Kieran stepped back into the cave an hour later, he wore the same perfectly crafted mask of gentle concern that had fooled Elara so completely. He settled beside her on the furs, his hand reaching out to stroke her hair with a practiced ease that made her skin crawl. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his golden eyes shimmering with a false worry that Elara now recognized as the calculated gaze of a scientist examining a specimen. "I wanted to thank you," Elara replied, her voice steady despite the rage building like a physical pressure behind her ribs. "Thank you for showing me who I really am." She stood gracefully, moving to the mouth of the cave where he had just stood plotting her destruction. She saw the exact moment his predatory instincts went on high alert, his hand stalling midair. "Did you know that silver flame healers have enhanced hearing when we're emotional?" she asked, her smile turning into a blade of silver fire. "Especially when we're heartbroken." The mask dropped from Kieran's face, leaving something cold, calculating, and lethal in its wake. "I see," he said quietly, rising with a predatory grace. "And here I thought I'd have more time to complete the bonding before you figured it out." He tilted his head, studying her with detached interest, nodding that she was angrier than his preliminary bonding had predicted. "Your mistake was thinking I'd be easy to break," Elara snarled, silver flame beginning to flicker around her fingers in response to her fury. She could feel the mate mark on her shoulder burning, the psychic influence trying to sink deeper into her thoughts, whispering that she should trust him and be compliant. It was a biological trap, a tether designed to turn her into an obedient vessel for his own immortality. With a scream of defiance, Elara reached deep into the core of her power and burned it all away. The psychic connection snapped like a dry twig in a furnace. "I am not your weapon," she cried, her voice echoing with harmonics that made the stone walls of the mountain tremble. Raw, primal force, the result of 3 years of exile and rejection, poured out of her like a tsunami. The cave filled with a blazing silver light so intense it turned the air into liquid fire. Kieran shifted into his massive direwolf form, but even the ancient king was no match for a silver flame healer who had stopped holding back. As she rose off the ground, surrounded by an aura of starlight, Elara realized she was the bridge between worlds, and she would never be anyone's sacrifice again. She looked down at the cowering wolf and felt her rage crystallize into something harder than diamond. The leash was broken, and for the first time, the Alpha King was the one who had reason to fear. The silver flame around Elara reached its crescendo, the mountain itself groaning under the weight of her untapped fury. As the blinding light consumed the cave, the physical world began to fray at the edges, dissolving like parchment in a forge. Kieran's massive wolf form was the last thing she saw before she stepped through the stone wall as if it were mist, leaving behind the ashes of his plans and the reality she had known. She emerged into the between space, a shimmering realm of silver mist and starlight where all possibilities converged. Here, the silver flame did not just burn, it acted as a mirror, revealing truths in their most terrible and beautiful glory. Figures began to coalesce from the mist, beings of ethereal light whose faces mirrored her own, aged by eons of wisdom. These were the first ones, the original silver flame healers who had walked between worlds when the barriers of creation were still young. "Your rage is justified, daughter," the central figure spoke, her voice carrying the weight of ancient prophecies. "But this is not your moment of choice. A greater darkness comes." As the ancestors gestured toward the swirling mists, dimensional windows opened, showing Elara a threat far more ancient than Kieran's petty politics. She saw the Devourer of Lights, a primordial presence that had been waiting since the dawn of time for the barriers of the world to weaken. The shadow walkers that had plagued her were merely scouts. The true enemy sought to drag all existence back into the void. The spirits revealed that every rejection Elara had faced, the exile from the Silver Moon, the betrayal by Kieran, had been a crucible to prepare her for this stand. They showed her that the barriers were failing because the world's life force was being drained by the encroaching shadows. "You are the bridge between worlds, the guardian who stands at the crossroads of destiny," the spirits whispered in unison. "You must decide whether to save the world that rejected you or watch everything burn for its sins." Elara looked back through the rift at the mortal realm, where reality was beginning to unravel. She saw the wolf who had tried to claim her and the packs that had hunted her, all of them ignorant of the abyss opening beneath their feet. The silver flame around her fingers pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat of the universe, waiting for her to choose between vengeance and salvation. Reality shuddered as the final seal cracked, and the Devourer of Lights began its slow, hungering crawl into the mortal realm. From the between space, Elara watched the world she had known begin to unravel. Shadows moved of their own accord, and the sky bled the color of a dying star. She stepped back through the rift into the mountain cave, her presence now a towering pillar of silver flame that made the crystal walls pulse with blinding light. Kieran was there, but the arrogant king who had plotted to leash her was gone. He stood amidst the tremor of the mountain, watching his kingdom crumble and the smoke of burning settlements rise in the distance. When he saw Elara emerge, no longer a fugitive but a legend incarnate, he did not reach for his crown or his weapons. Instead, he dropped to both knees, his head bowed in a gesture of absolute submission that no Alpha King had ever performed. "Elara," he choked out, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had lost his soul to his own shadows. "I was a coward. I feared your light so much that I convinced myself manipulation was safer than trust. I tried to cage the only thing this world needs to survive." He looked up at her, and Elara saw the devastating truth in his golden eyes. He wasn't begging for his life, but for the lives of the innocent people his arrogance had placed in the Devourer's path. "I don't deserve a second chance," he whispered, his voice cracking with a remorse that burned deeper than her flame. "But they do. Please, save them, even if you choose to leave me to the void." The Devourer's laughter echoed through the mountain, a sound of endings and emptiness. Elara looked at the king kneeling before her, the man who had broken her heart and the leader who had finally found humility. She felt the silver flame inside her recoil at the thought of vengeance. As a guardian, she could not choose based on a personal grudge when existence itself was at stake. "You wanted to see what I am, Kieran," Elara said, her voice echoing with the power of the first ones. "Now watch." She turned toward the encroaching darkness, her silver flame erupting like wings of starlight that spanned the width of the cavern. She would stand as the bridge between worlds, holding the line against the oblivion that sought to claim the night. The true battle was just beginning, but as Elara Moonstone rose to meet the darkness, she knew she was no longer nobody's victim. She was the salvation the world had tried to destroy. As Elara stood at the mouth of the cavern, the world outside descended into a nightmare of shadow and silence. The Devourer of Lights was no longer a whisper of prophecy. It was a physical weight pressing against reality, a presence that sang of endings and the cold void. Kieran remained on his knees, his forehead nearly touching the stone floor in a display of complete abdication. "I looked for you for a decade, believing you were the key to my power," he murmured, his voice hollow with regret. "I was so blinded by the crown that I couldn't see the woman standing in front of me. I am the shadow that failed the light." Elara didn't look back at him. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon where the sky was fraying, silver light bleeding from her fingertips and weaving into a shield that pushed back the encroaching dark. "You wanted a weapon to secure your immortality, Kieran," she said, her voice carrying the harmonics of the ancient oracles. "But a weapon has no choice. A guardian does, and I choose to stand." With a final surge of power, Elara's silver flame erupted, not to destroy the man who had betrayed her, but to bridge the gap between the crumbling mortal realm and the ancient strength of the spirit world. As she stepped forward into the air, the light from her soul illuminated the northern territories, signaling to every terrified soul that the exile had returned, not for vengeance, but as their final hope. The true battle for the dawn had begun.